Welcome, everyone. Hello, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Charlotte von Robert, the director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome everyone. And I want to especially thank the Taube Foundation for making this event possible. We actually had an entire weekend around the Bay with Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett talking also in Berkeley and at the GTU and the Magnus Museum and in San Francisco yesterday. So it's the Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett weekend. So I'm happy to welcome you to Stanford. Barbara, or as she's also known as BKG, has many roles and has worked in different contexts, so many that it's difficult to know where to start. So today she's coming to us as the chief curator of the core exhibition at POLIN, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And she's also on the board of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, which initiated the project to create POLIN Museum. Of course, the Bay Area has a strong connection with the museum through the Taube Foundation and the Correspondence Foundation, and Shana Penn is in the back also from the Taube Foundation. There could not have been anyone better to serve as a curator for this fabulous and widely recognized museum in Warsaw. Since Barbara's family's life is rooted in Poland. Both her parents came from Poland and emigrated in time before the war to Canada. And as many of you know, we are lucky to learn so much about Polish Jewish culture through the lens of her father, because Barbara got her father to paint his childhood, which turned not only into an exhibition that also appeared in the Bay Area in 2004-07, in the Magnus Museum as well as in New York City, but also into a beautiful book, which you came here to talk about also. They called me Mayor Julie, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust. Barbara wrote and co-wrote many books, including Image Before My Eyes, a photographic history of Jewish life in Poland, 1864 through 1939, which she did together with Lukian Dobrowski. I don't have Polish, so you have to excuse my pronunciation, which also turned into a beautiful movie, as the movie expanded beyond the photographs to home movies and sound recordings from that time period before the war, so very special. She also wrote in 1998 Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums and Heritage, and gave a wonderful seminar this afternoon with students in the Performing Art and Museum Studies program. And she co-edited with Jonathan Karp, The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, and more recently with Jeffrey Chandler, who I think was here this weekend, also Anne Frank Unbound, Media, Imagination and Memory. She's now the University Professor Emerita and Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, where she has also is affiliated with the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. She was honored for Lifetime Achievement and has indeed so many awards. I can't name them all, but just a few. Lifetime Achievement Award by the Foundation for Jewish Culture, received an honorary doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and the 2015 Marshall Square Award for her contribution to the social scientific study of Jewry. And she was recently decorated with the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Are you a knight now? By the President of Poland for her contribution to POLIN Museum. She currently serves on the advisory boards for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and the Council of American Jewish Museums and many other museums, including in Lithuania and Israel. So without further ado, please help me welcome Barbara to the podium in Stanford.
So first of all, I want to say how very, very pleased I am to be here. And I want to thank Toby Philanthropies and Shana Penn especially for organizing this weekend. And I want to thank the Toby Center for Jewish Studies for sponsoring this lecture tonight. It's really a pleasure to be able to share with you the work that we've done in Warsaw at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of POLIN Museum. These are the words that Arnold Eisen, Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, wrote shortly after October 28th, 2014, after he had attended the grand opening of the museum and the opening of the core exhibition. Now, this museum, I think, is all the more impressive and all the more important when one understands where it has been built. It has been built literally in this spot, on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and destroyed what was the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, which had been home to the largest Jewish community in Europe. Before the war, this was a bustling, thriving Jewish area, and on the left you can see a courtyard, a business courtyard off of Nalewki Street, which was the heart of the Jewish neighborhood, and on the right you can see a plaque that is mounted today on a communist-era apartment building on a street that is called Nalewki, but is not in the original location. And all that this plaque says is, this street, that is to say the street that was named Nalewki, got its name from the name of the river that supplied the city of Warsaw with its drinking water. And there's no mention of what you see on the left. And what that means is that the Jewish presence, the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, has been so overshadowed by the Holocaust, by all that was destroyed, that we have an enormous obligation and opportunity to recover that history and to transmit the civilization that Polish Jews created to future generations. This is the great synagogue on Tłomackie Street that opened in 1878. It was the pride and joy of Jews who called themselves Poles of the Mosaic faith, who had great optimism in the prospects of integration, who were fluent in Polish, who were very adept in Polish culture, and who thought of themselves as Jews, but also Polish. And if one looks on the left, you will see part of the Tłomackie Synagogue complex, which was their Judaic Library and Institute of Judaic Studies. After the Germans destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto, after they suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, they then proceeded to destroy the Tłomackie Synagogue. And all that remained was the shell of the Judaic Library and the Institute of Judaic Studies. And that building stands today. It has been repaired, and it is today the home of the Jewish Historical Institute. The Jewish Historical Institute is one of two projects. The other is POLIN Museum, under the umbrella of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. The association is a Jewish NGO that was established in Poland in 1951. It evolved out of the immediate post-war Central Jewish Committee and its Central Jewish Historical Commission. And this association, and we're very pleased today that the chairman of the board of the association, Piotr Wiślicki, is here, and Marta Wrubel, our development director, are here, both of them from Warsaw. They were really instrumental in helping us to complete the project of POLIN Museum, to raise the money for it and to really complete it. And the association has these two responsibilities, the Jewish Historical Institute and POLIN Museum. The museum is located on that rubble, and on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1948, on the rubble, the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the monument to the ghetto heroes, was unveiled. And it is facing that monument, facing the side of the monument that shows the fighters, and facing a monument that on the other side shows the great deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto several months earlier in 1942. And it is in this way that this museum completes the memorial complex. The idea for the museum arose in 1993, but it wasn't until 1996, and it is the initiative of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. It was in 1996 that it was embraced as a project, and the city of Warsaw designated this area facing the monument as a place for the future museum in the miracle that such a museum would ever be built. Because in 1993, it's only 4 years after the fall of communism, and to have such an idea to create a museum of the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews 4 years after the fall of communism, and the association at that moment had never made a museum and had never raised the kind of money that's required. And so really, truly, it took enormous idealism on the part of people who were not realistic to imagine such a project and to get it started. But it took people with incredible expertise and very realistic, like like Piotr Wislicki, to bring that project, in fact, to completion. And so the relationship of the museum to the monument is a key to what this museum is. It completes the memorial complex. We go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died, and we come to the museum to honor their memory and the memory of those who came before them by remembering how they lived, and how they lived for 1,000 years continuously in this territory. Now, the museum is clad in glass like fins on a fish, and on that glass is silk screened the word POLIN, and I'll explain in a moment why this museum is called POLIN, and you see it here in Hebrew letters and in Latin letters. And the building itself, being clad in glass with these beautiful glass windows, is all about reflection, transparency, light, and openness. To build a glass building on a site of genocide is a gesture of hope in the face of tragedy. I don't know of any other genocide site that has that basically has a glass building. I think it's extraordinary. And the building itself is very modest, very minimalist on the outside, and it's out of respect for the monument, and all the drama is on the inside with these beautiful organic forms, this very, very warm, sandy color, and it is from here that we enter the core exhibition. Now, the core exhibition is rather more what I call a theater of history than vitrines of objects, although objects will play a very, very important role. We began without a collection, and we established a collection for the purposes of the exhibition, and the museum continues to develop its collection, but a collection, any collection alone, would not have been adequate to being able to present this 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. Simply not possible. Our greatest asset was intangible, immaterial. Our greatest asset was and is the story. And in a sense, there's some of my colleagues who are in beautiful historical synagogues with big collections, and they said, you know, you're lucky you didn't have a building or a collection. They said if you had a building, you'd be forced to show the exhibition in a building that was never intended for an exhibition. And if you had a collection, you'd be forced to show it. So in a sense, we could make a virtue of necessity. Now, the idea arose in 1993, inspired by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Grażyna Pawlak, who was then associated with the association, saw that exhibition, and she said, if there is a museum of the history of Polish Jews, if there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. In a sense, the last thing that Poland needed was a Holocaust museum. The whole country is already a Holocaust museum. But the history of Polish Jews had been completely, understandably overshadowed, and not only had the world lost 3 million Polish Jews, they'd also lost the world that they had created, and they'd also lost the memory of that world, and that it was a moral obligation to recover that history and to recover that world and to recover that memory and to transmit it to future generations. And so in 1996, the association took responsibility for really making this into a project. The person who led the project for the first 15 years is a man by the name of Jerzy Halberstadt. And he then proceeded to organize the historical program, a database of material, and to work with a British design firm, Event Communications, on a master plan for the exhibition. And this is before the exhibition itself was actually founded. This is before there was an actual building. It wasn't until 2005 that the association joined with the Ministry of Culture in the city of Warsaw to actually establish the museum. And it was only in that year that the association organized an international competition. It is the first successful international competition for a public building in Poland, and I think probably still is. Now, the division of labor, I think, is very important, and that is that the city of Warsaw and the Ministry of Culture took responsibility for the building, that they would pay for the building from Polish taxpayer dollars, approximately $70 million US, actually a bit more, and not European Union money, and that the association, the Jewish NGO, a small private organization, would take responsibility for creating the exhibition, producing the exhibition, and raising the money for the exhibition. And it raised more than $40 million for the exhibition and additional for educational and cultural programs. And it's thanks to donors such as the Toby Philanthropies and other donors in the US, in Europe, and also, I would say, in Poland. The single largest gift was from a non-Jewish Polish businessman, from Jan Kulczyk. And so it was through that kind of effort, that kind of joint effort, that it became possible to create this museum. 2013 was the opening of the building. The grand opening with the core exhibition was in 2014, and by the end of 2015, we had about 1 million visitors, which is also extraordinary. And really, I would say, well, there's an interesting conversation as to why. Why and how is it that this museum has managed to attract such a large number of visitors? And I would say that in the winter, it's about 70% visitors from Poland, 30% from abroad, about half Jewish, and in the high season, 50 to 60% are from Poland, and the others are international. And so the stages and the steps from 1996 until 2005 were essentially preparation for really taking on the creating of this exhibition. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of conceptual underpinnings of the master plan. In 2006, I was invited to lead the development of the core exhibition, and we, together with Jerzy, formed an international academic team. It was multidisciplinary. Historians, a social psychologist, literary historian, art historians, anthropologists, a very diverse team from Israel, from Poland, and from the United States. Now, it's very important for us that this museum not deliver what I would call a master narrative. And in other words, a one-line story with a clear conclusion. And although that might seem like a good idea, our feeling is that this story would be much better told in a way that was open and in a way that invited our visitors to really reflect on many unresolvable, if you will, issues in the story. But at the same time, Moshe Rossman, a very fine historian of the early modern period of Polish Jews, he said, okay, no master narrative, but you are working with what he called meta-historical principles. So what are some of those principles? There are many more, but let's start with these. The first principle has to do with the period of the story. I've often been asked, what is the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually the person asking already knows. For many, it's the Holocaust, understandably. For others, it's the post-war years because it's their period, it's the period through which they lived. And for others, it may be the interwar years. It might be the period of their parents, in my case, for example, or their grandparents. Nobody says the Middle Ages, which is more than half of the millennium of this story. And from my point of view, and I believe that the whole team agrees, the most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years. 1,000 years of continuous Jewish presence in this territory. And that's not something you can say about Spain, England, Germany, Austria, parts of Italy, France. It is really exceptional, and it is, unless one understands the importance of that 1,000-year continuous presence, one cannot understand how this territory became home to the largest Jewish community in the world, and a center of the Jewish world, and the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world. The second principle is that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that they're not only in Poland, but they're also of Poland. And this really works against, I would say, certain preconceptions of Jewish isolation. Third principle, that this is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration. In other words, a spectrum of relations, a spectrum of relations. There are some periods and some places and some moments where one of those binaries is more important and others where the other is more important. But that spectrum of relations is a fundamental principle in our narrative. That Jews created a civilization that is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish, and we have some wonderful examples that I will share with you in a moment. That Jews became this largest community, and the factors that led to that, and the factors that led to the creating of such a large and such a creative community, those are factors that we like to explore and help our visitors understand. The power of telling the story in the very place where it happened. That might seem obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times I presented this project here in the United States and Canada, and my Jewish audience generally would say, well, why are you making this museum in Poland? And I said, well, you don't ask that question about the Jewish Museum, the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, or about the Jewish Museum in London, or the one in Paris. They said, you should make it in Tel Aviv or in New York. And this museum could never have the impact that it is currently having, both for Jewish visitors, Polish visitors, and international visitors, could never have the impact that it has were it to be anywhere but in the very place where the story happened. And finally, we're a site of conscience. We are on a site of genocide, and our goal is to create a zone of trust, a trusted zone within which our visitors, all of our visitors, can feel confident and and feel a sense of trust for engaging with extremely difficult subjects. And so those are among our principles. Now, I said earlier that our exhibition is a theater of history. In other words, it is a story that unfolds in three-dimensional space, and the story only advances as the visitor moves. So it's a very, very special experience. And we always wanted, even from the stage of the master plan, to begin the story in a poetic space, in a kind of a space that would, in a sense, prime the visitor, prepare the visitor to enter the historical narrative. And it was imagined from the very beginning that we would begin in a forest, in a space of historical imagination, in a place that was time before time. And we would begin with a legend the Jews told themselves about how they came to Poland, why they came to Poland, and why they stayed. And so we chose the legend, we call it the legend POLIN. It never had a title, as legends don't usually have titles. And we chose a version that had been retold by Agnon, the Nobel laureate for Hebrew literature. And the legend goes something like this. Jews were suffering from persecution in the West. They came east. They found themselves in a forest. And then, depending on the legend, the clouds broke and an angel's hand pointed and they heard the word POLIN. Or the birds chirped and they heard POLIN. Or pages of the Gemara floated down. Or there were letters in Hebrew carved on the trees. And when they heard the word POLIN, according to the legend, they thought they heard Hebrew. They thought they heard POLIN. Here rest, here you shall rest. And so they said to themselves, and here we shall rest until we are taken to the land of Israel, that is to say, until the Messiah comes, which is a very, very long time. And so this is how we begin the story, and we wanted to begin it and take inspiration from the primeval forest, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Treasure in the northeast of Poland, and the legend as retold by Agnon. Now, when we pass from this very poetic space of legend to the first historical gallery, the medieval gallery, which takes us from 965 to 1507, we have a very long period of time, and these are the only two kinds of objects that exist in the world, not that we have, that exist in the world from this period, from this place, that are specifically connected to Jews. What are they? The earliest tombstone, 1203, for David, son of Sar Shalom, which suggests that he was Sephardi, of beautiful voice, which suggests he was a cantor, and it's the earliest tombstone. And we have coins, nothing of that size, I can assure you. They're the size of a penny. The size of a penny. They are tiny, but they have Hebrew inscriptions which we take as an indication that Jews were involved in minting, whether they were administrators in the royal mint or they had a privilege to mint a certain number of coins. And these coins will refer to Mieszko, the king of Poland, with a blessing like bracha v'hatzlacha. And so this is the material we have to work with. But what we did, which is consistent with our approach, which is that our greatest asset is the story, is we went to our sources, to rabbinical correspondence from the period, letters that rabbis wrote to each other. We went to chronicles, we went to legal documents, we went to travel accounts, and we pulled from those accounts stories that would reveal what it was like for Jews who were initially traveling through this territory and then eventually settling and eventually forming communities. And we had to find a way to make those stories tangible, visible, concrete. So what did we do? We first of all went to illuminated manuscripts, Ashkenazi illuminated manuscripts, largely from the Rhineland, as well as Christian manuscripts from this period, and we gave them to two of Poland's most celebrated comic book artists. And Tomek Leśniak, he is famous for Jeź, George the Hedgehog. This happens to be a poster for a film based on his comics that says Nie dla dzieci, not for children. And so he's got comic books for kids, and he's also got, obviously, his adult comic books. And we said to them, we want you to illustrate our stories from our primary sources from the period. And we then created, in this case, a very, very beautiful animation of the 965, that is the year of the travel account, very famous travel account of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Jew from Cordoba, who was sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe. And in this travel account, which was written in Arabic, which is why you see Arabic script, it's a quotation from the account. In this account, this account is the earliest extant description of Poland, which is why Polish school children know two things about Jews. They know Ibrahim ibn Yaqub and they know the Holocaust. And hopefully they'll now know a lot more of what's in between. So we hired the conservators that specialize in conserving the painted interiors of Polish churches, and we asked them to paint the walls and using traditional pigments and techniques. And we also commissioned a man who specializes in gilding, in traditional gilding with real gold leaf. And so the result is a hand-painted gallery. In a multimedia narrative exhibition, you don't expect a handmade gallery. You expect films, projections, all kinds of fancy gee-whiz technology. You don't expect a handmade gallery. And the result is like being in a 360-degree life-size illuminated manuscript. And it's an extraordinary and a very, very beautiful way of communicating how, from a few traveling merchants in the beginning of the medieval period, by 1507, this territory is on the verge of becoming the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world. And by that moment, we've got about 15,000 Jews living in Poland in about 100 places, with about 50 places that have Jewish communities. When we cross the threshold between the medieval period and the early modern period, we enter the period when Poland joined with Lithuania. Ukraine was already part of Poland, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the biggest countries in Europe, one of the most powerful, one of the most economically vibrant, and one of the most diverse in terms of religion, language, culture. And this is the territory that is, and this is the period, 1569 to 1772, that is considered in Polish history a golden age. We use the word golden age in quotation marks because it's something of an historical cliche, but also in Jewish history, Polish Jewish history, it's also considered a kind of golden age. And one of our questions is, how golden was it? And what made it golden to the extent that it was? And in order to get at that, we brought together multiple voices. And this is a principle throughout the exhibition, that there should be multiple voices from the period. Sometimes they are in harmony and sometimes they are dissonant. And one of the sort of starting points is a satirical poem written on the occasion of a coronation that was critical of everything in the Commonwealth. And you can see it in Latin, the original Latin, and then in Polish and English translation. The Polish kingdom is paradise for the Jews, hell for the peasants, purgatory for the burghers, rule by servants, Paradise for the Jews, Shelter for Heretics, let me see here, Harvest for Foreigners, and Fatherland of Immigrants. Sounds like Europe today. We then juxtapose that with a quotation from Rabbi Moses Isserles, who was a great Polish rabbi in this period, the Ramu or the Ramah, and he had low expectations. Their hatred for us in this country has not overwhelmed us as in the German lands. May it remain so until the coming of our Messiah. So clearly, this is the early modern period. It doesn't, tolerance, what it means today, what it meant then, is not the same thing. But this collection of statements comes from a Karaite, a rabbi. It comes from a satirist who's critical, from a nobleman, and that already establishes that this is a multi-voiced story and a multi-perspective story, and that's very important to us. This is a period of great prosperity and of cultural richness, which we try to communicate in this open plan gallery, and which is organized around a model of the royal city of Krakow and nearby Kazimierz, because Jews were moved from a street, the Jewish street in medieval Krakow, and then came to live in an area that is preserved to this day in Kazimierz. Kazimierz at that time was a separate area. Today, the river has been filled in, and it's all part of Krakow. And how do you make concrete the idea that what made this age very important from the point of view of Polish Jews was the rise of rabbinical authority, as expressed in Rabbi Moses Isserles, Yiddish and Hebrew printing, yeshivas? Well, one of the ways we tried to do it was by taking something very material and very concrete, printing, which had a huge impact. Now, of course, we show an original book from the period by a Jewish printer from the Commonwealth, and it's in our collection. But that by itself doesn't communicate the story. And in order to engage younger visitors, although it turns out that the older visitors love this even more, we decided to make printing presses. Real presses where you turn something and it makes a press and it makes an imprint. And so our visitors can actually print the title page of the first edition of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, with the notes by Rabbi Moses Isserles explaining that according to the Sephardic code, we do things like that. But here in Poland, we do things like this. And now, can you imagine, hundreds, if not thousands, of Polish visitors are taking away the title page of the Shulchan Aruch with the Ramu's notes, and I don't know if they're framing it, hanging on the wall, putting it in a drawer, but I don't think the Ramu would ever have imagined that such a thing could happen. But it's not enough to print a title page or to print a printer's mark or to look at an original book. We wanted to open those books up. And so we created a library, and we used as an inspiration the Stender, the sort of reading desk that we associate with the synagogue and with the yeshiva as well. And we were able, by creating digital interactive presentations of the insides of these books, we were able to present our visitors with their content. But their content is so esoteric. I mean, consider one of the most important, the Share Dura. It's a handbook for kashrut. The first few pages are about the salting of meat. And our hardship case is the 15-year-old Polish boy. So that really required a lot of imagination on our part to somehow open the book but make it accessible. But we were also able to present material that's never been shown before. And in this particular case, a Kabbalistic scroll, that is to say a scroll that is the copying of one of these Jewish mystical scrolls, was part of the education and spiritual development of a young scholar. And David Darshan, a student of the Ramu, went to Modena and he copied this scroll. This scroll, nobody could find it. It had been moved from one library in England to another one, and then the number for it got mixed up with something else. But my young curators at the museum, they would not give up. We knew this existed, and we found it. We got high-resolution scans, and we were able to present it and give our visitors a chance to enlarge it and also to learn more about what's actually on it. The economic story is a story of Jews as agents of and managers and middlemen for the nobility, helping them to manage assets on their noble estates, which meant coming into close contact with the peasants. And this created enormous tension and conflict, which erupted in 1648 with a Cossack uprising, a Cossack and peasant uprising. This uprising is remembered in, if you will, Jewish memory as the worst catastrophe between the destruction of the temple, of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, and the Holocaust. And we have an extraordinary account of this uprising by a Jewish eyewitness, Nathan Hanover, and we're able to narrate the story of this event through his eyewitness account. When we come through this corridor of fire, the 1648-49 corridor of fire, we come to a gallery that we call the Jewish Town. And what we do is we go from that big picture that we had with the Krakow model and with the story of rabbis and printing, and we zoom in on everyday life in the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement, which is to say in these private, noble towns, particularly in the southeastern part of the Commonwealth, but everywhere. And why would we call them Jewish towns? Because first of all, Jews lived predominantly in cities, large and small, and in towns, large and small. And wherever they lived, they tended to form a substantial percentage of the population, 30, 40, 60, 80, even 90%. In my father's town of Apatov before the war, there were 10,000 people, 6,500 Jews. Warsaw was a third of the population was Jewish. Lodz, a third of the population was Jewish. Krakow, a quarter. Białystok, more than half. And so when you have a critical mass of Jews, it gives the town a particular character and it allows Jews to develop a very distinctive way of life. And it was that we wanted to capture in the period of 1648 to 1772. So one centerpiece, one, if you will, center of gravity of the Jewish town is the marketplace, and around the marketplace, the tavern, the Jewish home, where we're able to explore the inner spiritual lives of women, family, and we're probably the only Jewish museum in the world that has a church. And we're quite proud of our church. And the purpose of this particular setting is to explore the changing relationship of the church and the Jews during this period, during the second half of the Commonwealth period. The second center of gravity is, of course, the synagogue. And not only what goes on inside the synagogue, but also the emergence of new spiritual leaders and movements, which we show all around the edges, from the heretics like Jacob Frank to, if you will, heterodoxy, the Vilna Gaon, which then develops into the modern yeshiva, Hasidism. We present here the beginning of the story of the Baal Shem Tov and Mendel Levin, and the beginning of the story of the Jewish Enlightenment. Now, in the absence of original artifacts, in the sense of artifacts made out of the original material, we do have what I would call a new kind of artifact that is an actual artifact, but that's different from what we think of as an original artifact. Excuse me. Now, during the 17th and 18th centuries, there were hundreds of wonderful wooden synagogues. They were just the most extraordinary architectural expressions, just extraordinary. They were very interesting in terms of their construction, and they were beautifully painted inside from floor to ceiling, like an Ottoman tent. And by 1942, during the war, the Germans had destroyed every standing wooden synagogue. There were none left. There are none of these great synagogues left. However, by the end of the 19th century, there was great interest in them, and there were efforts to document them with photographs, paintings, drawings, architectural cross-sections, floor plans, measurements. And we worked with a studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio, whose mission is to, quote, recover lost objects. And what they say is you can never recover the actual object, but you can recover the knowledge of how to make it by making it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And that's exactly what we did. And so we conducted six weeks, 3 2-week workshops in a folk architecture museum in the south of Poland, and we did all the timber framing. We started with 200 raw logs with the bark still on, and using traditional adzes and lathes and planes and pit saws, we were able to create the beams and all of the elements that went into the timber-framed roof. We drew on this kind of documentation. This is documentation from the end of the 19th century and the first 13 years, actually, of the 20th century, including these marvelous drawings. We then took apart what we had constructed in the south of Poland. brought the parts to the museum, reassembled it, hoisted it, it's 25 tons, suspended it from cables, and then we mounted these beautiful painted panels, which we also created in the same way in masonry synagogues all across the length and breadth of Poland in different towns, and with using altogether about 300 volunteers and experts, and engaging the local communities to take an interest in the history of their synagogues and the history of the Jewish past of their towns. And today, this is one of the great highlights of the exhibition and one of the great highlights of the museum. We've created also a prayer soundtrack based on historical work on Ashkenazi liturgy, and we have interactive stations where visitors can explore the iconography. And I do love the way in which we engage kids. They have their little cushion seats that have straps on them, and they walk around like turtles, you know, with the cushion on their back. And when we bring them into the synagogue, they can lie down and they can contemplate this wonderful, with the synagogue, we have wonderful projects with them as well. By 1772, this great big, huge Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had become quite decentralized. The nobles were in charge, the army was weak, and basically Russia, Prussia, and Austria saw an opportunity here, and they agreed with each other that each would take a piece of the royal cake. And they partitioned the Commonwealth. And between 1772 and 1795, basically Poland-Lithuania disappeared from the map. And now Jews and everybody else found themselves in a completely new situation. And so the long 19th century is a story that extends from the first partition, 1772, until World War I, when those empires collapsed. And our interest is in what we call encounters with modernity. We're interested in those encounters at an everyday level with ordinary people, dress reform, a reform of marriage age, a conscription into the army, new role for rabbis, taking on of last names, and many, many, many other ways in which there were efforts to reform Jewish life, and Jews responded in various ways. But we also look at more organized responses. And another lovely example of where, in the absence of anything material, we have taken the immaterial, which is to say the experience of the modern yeshiva, and we have made something that is among the most memorable moments in the whole exhibition. Now, when my colleagues, the historians, said that we needed to present not only the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and not only the expansion of Hasidism in this period, but also the modern yeshiva, I thought to myself, I don't think I can get the 15-year-old Polish boy interested in the modern yeshiva, and I asked for the material, and they said, no photographs, no objects, no paintings, no nothing. So I thought that's a good start. And then we commissioned some research on the part of a scholar who was finishing a PhD on the history of the modern yeshiva in the 19th century. And he sent us excerpts from memoirs of men who had been students in the yeshiva and also men who had visited the yeshiva. And the enthusiasm and the vividness of the descriptions was just completely inspiring. And so what we decided to do was to create a film. 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. And that what we would do is to do it in a sense in the idiom of the period. Now, they didn't have movies in this period, and they didn't have animation in this period. So we thought what we'll do is we will create the feeling that a 19th century painting has come to life. So we went into the studio, and in the computer we made the scenography. But then we went and we cast live actors, and we painted them. And among them is the son of Albert Stankowski, who had just had his bar mitzvah. This is a boy that was born and raised in Poland, had his bar mitzvah in Poland. And we took our painted actors and we filmed them in a green box, because when you do that, you can then put them into the scenography. And then we put the two together, we made the film, and we projected the film on canvas so that you could see the weave of the canvas, and we refilmed it on the canvas so that you could see the weave of the canvas. And it's really, I would say that sometimes having too much material is a curse, and having nothing, that you can sometimes create something absolutely stunning. And so this is really a case in point. And then the 19th century is not just about Hasidism and not just about the modern yeshiva. It's also about Jews who had social aspirations, who had the language and the cultural capabilities, the capital, to be part of the wider society of their peers. And that great Klamatsky synagogue we present here as a scale model. And scale models have enormous value. You're actually able to see the whole building in a way you wouldn't be able to do in real life. But this is really I would say, the touchstone for our presentation of another, if you will, another Jewish path in the encounters with modernity. We come to the middle of this gallery and we take the train station as a place to switch gears, speed up, because the pace of change now is moving much more rapidly with the invention of the railway, urbanization, and demographic expansion, social mobility. And Jews were instrumental in the financing and in the actual creating of the railway system in Congress Poland and leading into the territory around it. The second half of the 19th century is also a period of new forms of modern anti-Semitism. It's a period of the pogroms of the 1880s, of racial anti-Semitism. The Protocols of Zion are published before World War I, and this is a very difficult and important story, and it is linked on the one hand and also not linked to the emergence of new forms of Jewish national consciousness, Jewish self-understanding, the rise of Zionism, of the Jewish labor movement, a little bit later the Aguda, and the emergence of modern forms of Hebrew and Yiddish culture. World War I brings the empires to an end. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire. With World War I, the empires collapse and these new states form, and one of those states is the Second Polish Republic. It's a period of the 1920s and 30s, and there are many ways of looking at this period, but for us what's very important in this period, but also all the way through the exhibition, is that we want our visitors to stay in the moment of the story and not look forward and not anticipate. It's very important for us that our visitors not have in mind the Holocaust is coming, the Holocaust is coming. And that is terribly important because even sociologists and historians writing about the period, for example, Celia Heller wrote a book about the interwar years and she calls it On the Edge of Destruction. Well, nobody living in Poland at this time, no Jews, nobody saw the Holocaust coming. And so it was important for us that our visitors hold back on what they know happened later. And so as a result, what we've done here is to basically create an interwar years street. It's white relief facades on which we have projected the street, and then we have divided this short period thematically into 4 sections. And this is consistent with a different approach to this period. The approach that Ezra Mendelsohn has described as follows, that despite economic hardship, despite rising anti-Semitism, especially after 1935 with the death of Pilsudski, and that was the worst period of anti-Semitism in the whole history of Poland, that despite all of that, this was in its own way a second golden age, which he attributes to the vibrancy of Jewish political life and to the creativity of Jewish cultural life, to the investment in youth, and to a sense of rootedness and belonging in the place. And I know that in light of what we know of what happened later, it's very difficult to imagine what that was like. And that's our task in this gallery. And so, one area is devoted to politics, to Zionism, to the Aguda, the religious party, and to the Jewish labor movement. We line this gallery with a timeline of key events in this period and Jewish responses. We present Jewish culture starting with Yiddish and then increasingly moving towards Polish. The most important Jewish newspaper in the Polish language was Zionist. And I once asked my father, I said to him, I don't understand, with all your Zionist friends in your locale and on Hachshara, you all talk Polish and you sing Polish songs. I said, why? He said, well, we didn't want to speak Yiddish and our Hebrew wasn't good enough. And so Polish was a language that would allow those newspapers to be able to reach a wide public, particularly a middle-class public. And so, of course, the press is a wonderful emblematic expression of this cultural creativity and vitality. The upper area is dedicated to, on the one hand, growing up, and on the other hand, daily life. And the growing up story, And what includes some very, very beautiful elements. It includes the intergenerational conflicts, but it also includes the courtyard as a kind of autonomous child space. And I happen to love this area very much, and I was very, very pleased to be able to put my father into the exhibition. And so what you have here in the courtyard, we actually created that green table, and it has built-in chairs and it has drawers. And in the showcase on the surface of the table, it has the toys that my father remembers making when he was a child. And of course, it's not like today. Basically, he made the toys out of nothing. Out of a handkerchief. Actually, his mother made toys out of a handkerchief, a mouse out of a handkerchief to help, like if a child was crying, first you wipe his nose, then you take the hanky and you make a mouse, and then the kid stops crying. But out of paper, buttons, string, tin, and out of willow bark. Anyway, he taught me how to make more than 20 toys. And I made them for our exhibition. And I taught our educators how to make them. And they are teaching our guests, our visitors, the parents, the grandparents, and the children, how to make my father's toys. And you can see him in the middle with his willow bark shofar, which is a bark horn. He also called it a trompete. It's a bark horn. It's actually a very, very, very old musical instrument and very old toy. And when I showed it to the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow, they were astounded because it's completely died out in the rural areas of Poland. But he remembered how to make it from his childhood. And of course, I think a wonderful expression of this idea of vitality is in the tremendous investment in education and in the Jewish school systems, the Tarbut schools in Hebrew, the Tzisho schools in Yiddish, the gymnasia, the Jewish gymnasia in the Polish language, and a very wide network of the religious schools, of cheters and of yeshivas, including, of course, also the Bysyankov schools for girls that were really quite modern. And then daily life across the length and breadth of the Second Polish Republic. When we come to the Holocaust, we take a very, very special approach. And our approach is, first of all, to begin this gallery with September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, and to let the story unfold within the borders of occupied Poland, a Poland occupied by the Germans and also by the Soviets. And the second is to use the same principle that we used all the way through, which is to stay in the moment of the story, in the historical present, and to only use documents from the period, that were created at the time. And that is a huge challenge. It's if you will, a handicap that we imposed on ourselves. And as a result, and we were able to do it because we had an extraordinary resource, so which I will show you in a moment. And as a result, there is no post-war Holocaust survivor testimony in this gallery. We have access to the whole Shoah archive, and our visitors can go to our resource center, and they have access to unlimited number of Holocaust survivors on video, testimony on video. Incredibly important material. But here, all the material is from the period. So we begin with the process of separation and isolation in the German-occupied part of Poland, and then it culminates with the ghetto. And seeing as we are a site-specific museum and we are on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, we decided to use the principle that we use throughout of pars pro toto, the part for the whole. Rather than creating a kind of an amalgam, a little bit from here, a little bit from there, or a survey, we'd rather take one case. It is the largest ghetto, but it's also exceptional for another reason, and focus on it as a way of communicating that ghetto aspect of the Holocaust story, specifically in Poland. And so what we did was, we basically took two narrators, Adam Chernyakov, head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council that the Germans created to run the ghetto and carry out their orders. He kept a diary in Polish. And Emanuel Ringelblum, who was an historian of Warsaw Jews. He was a labor Zionist. He kept his diary in Yiddish. And we quote from them, and they become your companions. They accompany you through the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, through the excerpts from their diaries. Now, Emanuel Ringelblum was quite extraordinary. He established a secret archive, and the idea was that his team would, in secret, record and gather and document everything that was going on in the ghetto. And they believed that they would survive the war, and after the war, they would use the archive to write a history of the Warsaw Ghetto. But when they realized during the Great Deportation that they would not survive, they packed that archive up into tin boxes and milk cans, and they buried it in 2 locations. And after the war, those who survived actually went into the rubble of the ghetto. There are no streets. It was just rubble, as you saw at the very beginning. And they were able to locate 2 of 3 caches of these documents. And this is the material that we use in presenting the Warsaw Ghetto and much else in the Holocaust Gallery. So the Holocaust Gallery covers virtually all the major aspects of what happened in Poland itself, including Polish-Jewish relations, the full spectrum from the very worst to the very best, including stories of hiding, the Barbarossa campaign, the death camps, but it does so within the borders of occupied Poland, and it does so using only materials from the period. Now, many people said that we should end the exhibition with the Holocaust, that there's no story to tell after that. And we insisted that the post-war story is an extremely important story. Those of you who have visited the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan know that after you've visited the Holocaust Gallery on the middle floor, when you go to the upper floor, the renewal of Jewish life, the only areas that are talked about are United States and Israel. There's no Europe. It's as if Europe is a closed book. But Europe is not a closed book, and Poland is not a closed book. And so we bring our visitors into the Holocaust Gallery, we bring them into that devastated landscape, which is both literal and metaphorical. It is a destroyed world. Many of these individuals are the only people who survived in their family or from their town. Of the 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland before the war, 90% of them were murdered, and about 240,000 survivors were in Poland after the war. Most of them survived in the Soviet Union, and those who did, a certain number came back, others came out of hiding and from concentration camps. And one of the first things they did was to register, to fill out registration forms that were prepared by the Central Jewish Committee. And the Central Jewish Committee, in a sense, is the ancestor of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute and the Jewish Historical Institute itself. Excuse me. And so we wanted to communicate how few people survived, and so we created a wall of blank forms made out of ceramic tiles. And in the and we made interactive stations for the stories of those who survived in the Soviet Union, who survived in hiding, who survived and came out of concentration camps, and one so-called interactive screen that is just like a test pattern of people who didn't want to register, who did not want to be identified as Jews, who did not want to be found. Since we're on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, the commemoration, that 1948 image that I showed you at the very beginning, there's an extraordinary newsreel of the entire unveiling of the monument. And we were able, in this gallery, to show the importance of memorialization for the survivors. The most important question for those who survived and were in Poland immediately after the war was whether to stay or to leave. And the whole gallery is organized that on the right-hand side is the story of leaving, and on the left-hand side is the story of staying. And whether they were staying or leaving, memorialization was one of the very first and one of the most important tasks. And so that is, we really treat it emblematically through the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Monument. The story, on the side of the story of leaving, approximately 150,000 Jews left, of the 240,000 in Poland, left between 1945 and 1948. The Kielce pogrom and other forms of violence around that time, the Kielce pogrom is July 4th, 1946, there was emigration panic. And the emigration was prompted not only by anti-Semitic violence, but also by, there were Zionists that want to settle in Palestine, there were individuals whose only surviving relatives were living elsewhere. But the anti-Semitic violence of this period is one of the most painful, I would say, moments in the history of post-war Poland. And our approach to presenting this violence, I think, is very characteristic of the kind of openness and multi-voiced principle that we use. And so in the case of the Kielce pogrom, we actually present the story. Essentially, it's the blood libel, believe it or not. And we present 4 interpretations from the period of how it was understood, not from after 1989, after 2000, Jan Gross's books, but rather from within the period itself. And we ask our visitors to really think themselves into the mentality of the time. What do the communists say? What do the anti-communist underground say? What did the Bishop of Kielce say? And what did, if you will, the moral voice of the time say? And we present other examples from other places. Kielce was not an isolated case. Now, opposite the emigration wall is the wall that is devoted to Jewish life in Poland, particularly under communism. And I don't know how many of you realize that Poland was the second largest publisher of Yiddish books after the war. What country was the largest publisher of Yiddish books after the war? Not the US, not the Soviet Union, not Mexico, not Israel, Argentina. How did you know? Was it,
I'm looking for them.
it was Buenos Aires. But Poland was the second largest publisher, and because of communist cultural policy, it was socialist in content, national in form. And their idea of national was Yiddish, not Hebrew, because Hebrew was associated with religion and Zionism, which were no good, but Yiddish was okay. And so it's a wonderful opportunity in this so-called club, which was a space under communism where Jews gathered, to be able to explore that kind of cultural activity. 1968, March 1968, is a very, very painful moment. I would say the two sort of iconic moments in the history of post-war violence, post-war anti-Semitism, and emigration are the period of the Kielce pogrom and the period of March 1968. And in this case, the anti-Zionist, which was essentially an anti-Semitic campaign, led to the exodus of approximately 13,000 Jews, because at this point in time, there were a little over 20,000 Jews left in Poland. There had been 240,000 right after the war. As a result of emigration, there were now about 20,000, about 13,000 left, and they were living in Poland anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000. The numbers are not precise. And it was at this time, with this exodus, and an exodus of people who had stayed in Poland, who had never thought of leaving, who didn't want to leave, and who I would say were many of whom were surprised to either find out that they were Jewish or to discover that it mattered. And it mattered precisely because of this campaign. And so the period between 1968 and 1989 is a period characterized by a profound feeling of absence and the sense that this world is over, it will never reappear, it will never renew itself. But surprisingly enough, there emerged a small number of young people who, when they realized that they were Jewish, decided to do something about it. And they were referred to as the seedlings. And no one at the time knew whether from these seedlings a mighty oak might grow. And so it came as it was a relatively small group, but they were quite countercultural. To be Jewish was countercultural. And they turned not to their parents, who could not transmit anything to them of a Jewish nature, but to the Jewish catalog in the United States and to their Jewish peers here. And they then became leaders of the Jewish renewal, which we see today in Poland. And so when we exit and we enter the area dedicated to the period after 1989, we are now in the space of the building. And here, if you will, the motto is small numbers, big presence. That is, that the number of Jews in Poland today is small by absolute numbers and relatively small, but Jewish presence in Polish consciousness is enormous. And it is here that we use video interviews for the first time. We have approximately 20 people, Jews living in Poland today, from very young ones to older ones, and everything in between. And we ask them questions, and several of which I would never have thought of asking anywhere, for example, in this room. And one of the questions we ask is, did you always know you were Jewish? It's not a question I would ever ask here. I would never have thought to ask it. It came to me as a surprise. And it's a very, very important question. Some of them say yes, some of them say no, some of them did something about it, some of them didn't. But it's one of several questions. What does Israel mean to you? Is there a future for Jews in Poland? Is there anti-Semitism in Poland? Who can make Jewish culture? And the answers are really right across the board. And the core exhibition is at the very, very heart of this museum. But we are an educational and cultural institution, and it's very, very important for us to reach a wide public. Our target audience is what I think of as the transformative generation, which is to say adolescents and young adults. But actually, we got an award as being one of the best places for our oldest audience. And we pride ourselves on reaching across the entire age spectrum, and in reaching not only our audience in Poland, not only our Jewish audience, but also our international audience. Now, the final component of the core exhibition, which is a new component in the sense that we had always planned to have it and were not able to complete it by the time of the grand opening, is a component that will occupy a central circulation area in the core exhibition, where we will expand the geography of the story. I think, having made this exhibition in this museum in Poland, it's understandable that most of the story is set in the territory of Poland in any given historical period. But Polish Jews in the world is a much bigger story. And we feel that to expand that story would be very, very important, because that would be my story. It's the story of many of you in the room. It's the story of Jews in South Africa, in Australia, Canada, Israel, Europe. It's a very, very important story. And so it is, by some estimates, that as of 2013, with almost 14 million Jews in the world, approximately 70% have their roots in the historic territory of Poland. The historic territory of Poland is that big, huge red map. That includes what's today Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus. It includes some of the Baltics, parts of Russia. It's a very, very big territory, so about 9 million, more or less 9 million Jews. And so what we'd like to do is to explore the questions: where did they go? What do they take with them? What is the legacy of Polish Jews, and how does that legacy shape their lives today? And I hope that on the strength of this, you'll come. That's the goal.
Thank you, Barbara. This was extraordinary, a tour through 1,000 years of Polish history. She is on a whirlwind tour, and there's more appointments coming up, but we have time for 2 questions or so before.
And what we can do is gather the questions. If there are more, just ask them all, and I'll give one answer. How's that?
Who's the architect?
Okay, who's the architect? First of all, the architect. The architect is Rainer Mahlamaki. He's a Finnish architect. I'm convinced that only a Scandinavian could have been modest enough to create a building that would be so minimalist on the exterior and put all the drama on the interior. There were 250 architects in the competition, 11 finalists, and we were after one of the brief for the building was that the architecture should stand in a respectful and appropriate relationship to the monument. And the architects, they say that the best prize is second prize, because you get the prize and you don't have to build it. But I can assure you, Daniel Liebeskind, who was one of the starchitects in the competition, I wouldn't agree. Now, language. What's marvelous about this exhibition, in my opinion, is that it is probably the most multilingual exhibition you'll ever encounter. The languages of communication are Polish and English. Everything is in Polish and English. Everything is translated. All of the texts that we write are in Polish and English. Everything. And given that I'm a native speaker of English, I did everything I could to make sure that this was not Pinglish, but this was English. And so that's the first thing. But you'll probably never see as much Yiddish and Hebrew in an exhibition outside of Israel. Because by using primary sources, whenever we have a major quotation, we quote it in the original language. So when you first come into the gallery, the first quotations you see are in Hebrew. And all of those original quotations are in the historical font of the period, in the Latin font and also in the Hebrew letter font. And so the languages of the exhibition, in terms of the primary sources and in the graphic treatment of them, are Russian, Polish, Czech, Latin, Arabic, English, German, of course, Hebrew, Yiddish. That's 9, and I think there's even more. So I think that's a message, because even if you cannot read those languages, you get the message that this is a multilingual story, and that Jewish languages are very, very, very present, and beautifully present in graphically speaking. Then the Bund. The Bund is treated actually in several places. It's treated, first of all, as one of the many answers to the so-called Jewish question at the end of the 19th century. It's treated as a whole section in the Interwarriors in Politics, and we have a rousing rendition of the Shvua. In fact, when a group came of YIVO board members and from the Forverts, and they came to this section, they broke out in unison, singing the Shvua in the gallery, and people were just in shock. So, and then, of course, the Bund is terribly important in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and it's also important after the war. So I think that we do it justice, but there are some who think that maybe we do it too much justice, but that's another story. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of course. I actually almost included a slide to show you how we treat it. We have a very, very special way of treating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Two sides of a standing panel. One is the perspective of the fighters. The other is the strip report. But it's definitely a very, very important element. And it's the end of the Warsaw Ghetto story. And then we exit onto what we call the Aryan Street. The Jewish museums in Eastern Europe. There are three great big multimedia narrative museums in Eastern Europe, or in Europe, sort of Eastern Europe, that are telling a big story. 1,000 years, 250 years, 5,000 years, 2,000 years. I know you think that 5,000 years is a bit much for Europe, but it's not. Go to Moscow, to the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center. They begin the history of Russian Jews with Genesis. So it's but that's okay. That's another, would I love to talk to you about the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. If you go to the Berlin Jewish Museum, their story is 2,000 years. How did they get 2,000 years? We only got 1,000. Well, it's because there are evidence of Jewish presence from Roman times. Obviously, before there was a Germany, before there were German Jews. That's another story. So those are three really major museums that are multimedia narrative exhibitions and museums of comparable size and interesting architecturally. But the story, the most interesting story for me are the Jewish museums in post-communist Europe. And there's several new ones. Some of them are very small, very interesting. But it's that would be another great talk. So I hope, ask me back and we'll talk about the Jewish museums in Europe today. Then interwarrior films. In the area, one of my favorite parts of the whole exhibition is the upper level of the Interwarriors Gallery. On one side is growing up, on the other side is daily life. The side on daily life is actually dedicated to 13 different locations, and we show home movie footage for Novogrudek, and we show it for Kolbushova. These are two really locations for which there's wonderful home movie footage. And we do use that material in the exhibition. And we also use it on the street as part of our multimedia street. Change. Now, you'll forgive me, but no sooner did we open up the exhibition, everybody asked me, when are you going to change it? And I said, but we just made it. What do you mean, when am I going to change it? And actually, one of the reasons why I did not go back to NYU and why I decided to stay in Warsaw was to ensure that we didn't list with the wind with everybody's ideas about what it should be and how it should be, quote, changed. And so I would say that we are very... I am so thankful to our director. We have a wonderful director for this museum. His name is Dario Stola. He spoke here, I think, I'm told, to standing room only. Fortunately, there are a few people standing, so I can claim the same. And he is a very thoughtful, deliberative person. And so we've established an historical committee, and all changes, corrections, improvements, and changes go through this historical committee. They are also budgeted in terms of the resources that we have, and they will be implemented slowly and carefully over a period of time. And I can think immediately, let me answer the question a different way. What should be there that's not there? What would I like to add? Okay, that would be a better way to do it. So, for example, I don't think that music gets its due. We do. The music is in the exhibition. We do have a soundscape. We do have musical artifacts in the sense of period recordings, and we treat them as historical artifacts. But I think we could have done a lot more with music. And I think that were we to do this exhibition again, I would have built in the sound element much earlier in the entire planning process. It came quite late in the planning. I think that for the interwarriors, we don't do justice to Hebrew. I think we have a lot on Yiddish and a lot on Polish. I don't think we do justice to Hebrew. I think that at the end of the 19th century and during the interwar years, I think we could do more with the rise of right-wing nationalism and anti-Semitism. I think there are a number, but there are also some solutions that are what we call operational, which is to say, with a mobile application, we can actually take sound that we recorded and we're not able to implement, and we can actually integrate it through a mobile device. So there are some things we can do without, quote, changing the exhibition, which is like my nightmare. It has to be controlled, careful, deliberate, or the next thing we'll have is, what is it, a camel's a horse that was made by a committee? Well, we'll get a camel, not a horse. Let me see, that was that. Yes, changing exhibitions. Yes, temporary exhibitions. Very nice temporary exhibition program. And right now we have a marvelous temporary exhibition. It's on Frank Stella and the Polish Wooden Synagogue. I don't know how many of you know that Frank Stella, this great American abstract artist, Richard Meyer gave him a copy of a book called Wooden Synagogues by Maria and Kazimierz Piechotka. The book was published in Polish under communism in 1957 and in English translation, don't ask me why, in 1959. And how come Richard Meyer got his hands on it, I don't know, but he gave it to Stella. And in 1970, Stella was so inspired by this book that he did a series called his Polish Village series. And what he did was, the book is organized by locations. So if you would have Nowogródek or Kolbuszowa or Volpa, whatever it might be, that synagogue is documented, photographs, drawings, whatever. He was so intrigued by it that he did a series of works that start with drawings and then maquettes and then the work itself. Some of them are painted, some of them are not. And each of the works is named for the town from which the synagogue that he used, where the synagogue that he used once stood. And so we were able to work with him to present the original documentation, the original photographs, not just the book, the original photographs, the original drawings, and the works themselves, and the whole series of them in an exhibition that's at POLIN Museum right now. Our museum, the Warsaw. And what's amazing is I had an opportunity to interview Stella, and I had an opportunity to give him a tour of the exhibition. He's an Italian-American. I wasn't so sure he'd be so interested in 1,000 years of the history of Polish Jews. And then I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to be able to show him the ceiling. He never saw what it looks like inside in full color. And I brought him, and we looked at the ceiling, and he said, of no interest. Because he was only interested in the carpentry, in the joinery. So it's the part that's above on the main floor that comes up where you can see how the parts are put together and the intricate construction, and that's what interested him. So yes, we do have temporary exhibitions and a whole variety of them. A database of all the Jews born in Poland, no, but there is this Jewish Gen and all these genealogical projects, and there is JRI, Jewish Research Index, which is probably the most comprehensive record of Jewish births, deaths, marriages. I recommend it. And I think that was it.
Thank you so much.